Why isolation reveals a terrifying kind of intelligence. Schopenhauer, there's a strange moment that happens when you sit alone for long enough. The world becomes quieter, yes, but something else begins to stir beneath that silence, something ancient, something unsettling. You begin to feel yourself thinking in ways that don't happen when you're surrounded by people. You begin to see through things, customs, conversations, even your own personality. And then it hits you, maybe this is what thinking really is. Not reacting, not parroting, but confronting. That moment is both liberating and terrifying. And it's exactly the kind of experience Arthur Schopenhauer believed revealed a very specific kind of intelligence, one that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Schopenhauer had a reputation for being a pessimist, but that's too simplistic. What he really was honest. Brutally honest about human nature, society, and our desperate need for distraction. He observed something that many of us already know in our bones. Most people cannot be alone with their own minds. They fill their days with noise, with company, with tasks, not because they're productive, but because they're afraid of what they'll find when the distractions stop. And Schopenhauer didn't see that fear as weakness. He saw it as a test of whether a person was ready to face reality, and more importantly, whether they were ready to face themselves.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Now here's where things get uncomfortable. Schopenhauer argued that the more intelligent a person is, the more likely they are to seek isolation. Not because they hate people, but because they see through the illusion. They see how much of our social lives are a performance. Our conversations rarely lead to understanding. How most friendships are built not on shared truth, but on mutual avoidance. He wasn't saying all human connection is fake. But he was saying this: if your mind is truly awake, if you actually think at a deep level, then society becomes a kind of theater you can't unsee. And once you see it, it's hard to play along. So what does this terrifying kind of intelligence actually look like? It's not about IQ or academic achievement. It's not about how many books you've read. It's about depth of perception. It's about being able to sit in a room alone without needing validation and still feel whole. It's about seeing the absurdity of life and choosing to live honestly anyway. It's about realizing that most of what people chase, status, attention, approval, is a game designed to distract them from the emptiness they carry inside. And once you realize that, you have two choices: numb yourself again, or go deeper into the silence. That's why Schopenhauer believed solitude wasn't just a preference of the intelligent, it was their natural habitat. Because in isolation, the masks fall off. There's no one to impress, no one to compare yourself to. You're left with your thoughts, your fears, your desires. And that, paradoxically, is where real philosophy begins. Not in a university, not in a debate, but in the raw, unfiltered experience of being alone with truth. And that truth often hurts. You start to see how much of your personality is borrowed, how many of your beliefs are inherited, how much of what you thought was you is actually a collage of other people's expectations. But here's the twist: that pain is not the enemy. It's the doorway. Schopenhauer didn't believe isolation should make us bitter or cynical. He believed it should make us clear about what matters, clear about who we are when no one's watching. And most importantly, clear about the nature of the world, a world that, yes, is full of suffering, but also full of moments of profound beauty, if we're quiet enough to notice them. And that kind of beauty doesn't appear in the crowd. It emerges in the stillness, in the subtle, or in the solitude. Here's a question I want to ask you, and I want you to take it seriously. When was the last time you were truly alone, not just physically, but mentally? No phone, no music, no scrolling, just you and your thoughts. What would happen if you did that right now for an hour? What fears would surface? What truths would emerge? And what if those truths, however uncomfortable, were the very things you've been trying to find? We often assume that intelligence is about knowing more. But Schopenhauer flips that idea. He suggests that intelligence is about seeing more, seeing deeper, seeing past the noise, and that ability to perceive the world with clarity and without illusion is often born in isolation, where nothing is left to distract you from reality. That's why it's terrifying, because once you see the world clearly, you can't unsee it. And once you see yourself clearly, you can no longer hide. So the next time you feel that impulse to distract yourself, to check your phone, to socialize just to avoid boredom, pause. Ask yourself, what am I actually running from? And what would happen if, just once, you chose to stay? The silent abyss. Why deep thinkers withdraw from the world. There's a moment, after long enough in solitude, when the silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling endless, not peaceful, vast, and maybe even a little dangerous. This is the abyss that Schopenhauer warned us about. Because when you spend enough time alone, detached from the noise of the world, you don't just hear your thoughts louder, you begin to hear everything louder. The world doesn't just quiet down, it opens up. And for those capable of deep philosophical reflection, that opening can be both enlightening and unbearable. It's in that abyss that you begin to understand why so many thinkers eventually withdraw from the world, not because they've failed to engage with life, but because they've seen too deeply into it. Schopenhauer believed that the more clearly one sees the nature of existence, the harder it becomes to participate in it blindly. When you recognize that much of human interaction is built on illusion, on ego, on status, on comfort, you start to pull away, not out of superiority, but out of clarity. He called this the metaphysical nausea, the sense of existential sickness that comes not from despair, but from understanding too much too fast. It's like looking behind the curtain of life and realizing the whole play is being held together by threadbare logic and wishful thinking. Most people never see it because they're too busy acting. But the philosopher sits in the audience too long and eventually sees the strings. This is why many of the greatest minds in history have had an almost instinctive gravitation towards seclusion, not because they hated people, but because they had to retreat in order to think. Deep thought doesn't happen in the middle of applause. It happens in the quiet, often painful solitude where ideas can form without interference. And when you finally start to think without the influence of the crowd, something irreversible happens. You start to see how deeply irrational the crowd often is. You begin to understand that much of what the world values, wealth, fame, social approval, is anchored in fear, not truth. And once you've seen that, returning to the surface level concerns of daily life can feel like pretending to be asleep after you've woken up. But here's the paradox. The more you think, the more isolated you may become, but that isolation also allows you to see others more clearly. You begin to understand people's insecurities, their masks, their longing for meaning. You stop judging and start observing. You see the loneliness behind the laughter, the anxiety behind the ambition. And that's the terrifying intelligence Schopenhauer spoke of, not just the ability to see the world, but to see through it. And when you do, it becomes harder to engage in small talk, to chase superficial goals, to pretend that everything is fine when your soul knows it isn't. Have you ever felt that? That distance between you and the world, even when you're surrounded by people? That ache that says, they're talking, but we're not really saying anything. That moment when you realize you're playing a role, laughing at things you don't find funny, nodding at ideas you don't believe. That's not depression. That's awakening. And for many, that awakening leads to withdrawal, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Because when the soul begins to hunger for truth, it can't survive on the junk food of surface-level conversation. Schopenhauer didn't say this was easy. In fact, he said quite the opposite. But solitude, he warned, is not for the faint of heart. It exposes everything: your fears, your wounds, your illusions. But it also reveals your depth. And that depth, once accessed, becomes a kind of inner sanctuary. A place no one can touch. A place where your thoughts are your own, where your values are self-chosen, where your peace is not dependent on the chaos of others. So let me ask you, are you truly thinking your own thoughts or just echoing the noise around you? And if you were to step away, even briefly, from the expectations of others, from the roles you play, from the pressures to succeed, what would your mind begin to say? We often fear isolation because we think it means being alone. But Schopenhauer would say, isolation is only terrifying if your inner world is empty. True solitude doesn't disconnect you from life, it reconnects you to it, in a way that's raw, painful, but also profoundly real. And once you begin to live from that place, you no longer need the world to validate you. You've entered the silent abyss and discovered that the silence speaks. The curse of awareness, when seeing too much becomes a burden. Awareness is often celebrated as a virtue. Be more mindful, we're told. Stay conscious. And yet, Schopenhauer understood something most people don't. Awareness, taken to its extreme, is not a gift. It's a burden. Not because it makes life darker, but because it makes life clearer. And clarity, for those with philosophical depth, rarely brings comfort. It brings confrontation. When you begin to see the world with piercing honesty, you don't just see what's beautiful, you see what's broken. You see the contradictions people live with, the self-deceptions they cling to, the suffering they pretend doesn't exist. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the curse of awareness. It follows you everywhere. Schopenhauer's worldview was built on the idea that suffering is not an exception to human life, it's the rule. We are, according to him, driven by an insatiable will, a blind force that compels us to want, to strive, to chase things we believe will satisfy us, only to find ourselves empty once we attain them. And the deeper your awareness, the more you begin to recognize this pattern, not only in yourself, but in everyone around you. You see people chasing careers they don't care about, relationships that drain them, pleasures that numb them, all in an attempt to silence the gnawing dissatisfaction within. But no one wants to talk about it. So we distract ourselves. We build routines. We celebrate goals. We call it progress. But Schopenhauer saw it for what it was, a treadmill of desire that never stops moving. And this is where the pain of awareness multiplies. Because when you see through the illusion, you no longer have the luxury of pretending. You can no longer convince yourself that the next promotion, the next purchase, the next romantic partner will finally make you whole. You know it won't. You've seen the pattern. And that knowledge changes everything. But it isolates you. Not physically, but existentially. You can be in a room full of laughter and still feel like a ghost. Not because you're broken, but because you're awake. You've stepped outside the game, and once you're outside, it becomes nearly impossible to re-enter with the same enthusiasm. Have you ever looked around and felt like everyone else is playing a part, reading from a script, and you're the only one who forgot their lines? That's not disconnection, that's awareness, and it hurts. It's lonely, but it's also the beginning of something deeper. Because once you stop playing the game, you can begin to ask the real questions. What is all this for? Why do we suffer? What does it mean to live well in a world that seems indifferent to our happiness? These aren't questions most people want to ask, because they have no easy answers. They lead you down long, difficult paths that often lead to more solitude, more discomfort, more silence. But they also lead to truth. And for Schopenhauer, and for those who walk the philosophical path, truth is the only thing worth suffering for. Because only truth can offer a kind of peace that doesn't depend on circumstance. But it's not the peace of ignorance. It's the peace of someone who has looked directly at the chaos and still chosen to live with dignity, with restraint, with clarity. There's a danger in seeing too much, and Schopenhauer knew it. He carried the burden of that vision throughout his life. But he also believed that burden could become a blessing if you could carry it with strength. That's the challenge. Can you remain awake in a world that would rather you sleep? Can you keep your vision sharp without becoming bitter? Can you suffer consciously without becoming cynical? Let me ask you something most people will never ask you. What do you see that others pretend not to see? What truths have you been swallowing in silence just to keep the peace? And what would happen if you spoke them not to provoke, but to live honestly? The curse of awareness is that it isolates you. But the paradox is that it also connects you not to the surface of life, but to its core, to the raw, unfiltered reality that most people avoid. And in that place, you discover something powerful. You're not alone. Others have seen it too. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, the monks, the mystics, the poets. You join a hidden lineage not of pessimists, but of seers, people who chose truth over comfort, depth over distraction, meaning over momentum. So yes, awareness is a burden, but it's also a gateway. And if you can learn to carry it not with bitterness, but with grace, you'll find a kind of freedom that no distraction can offer. A freedom born not from escaping life, but from facing it completely. The freedom of the forsaken, how isolation becomes power. There comes a point in the journey after the silence, after the withdrawal, after the weight of awareness settles, that something unexpected happens. You stop resisting solitude. You stop mourning what you've left behind. The noise, the validation, the shallow comforts, they no longer call to you the same way. And in that stillness, in that forsaken space where no one is watching, something ancient begins to rise within you. Not fear, not despair, but power. a power that doesn't shout, a power that doesn't need an audience, a power born from the fact that you have faced the abyss and remained standing. Schopenhauer didn't see isolation as a prison. He saw it as a purification. When everything external is stripped away, when you're no longer distracted by praise or wounded by rejection, you meet the raw essence of yourself. And that encounter is terrifying not because it's empty, but because it's real. There's no one left to impress, no identity to perform, no tribe to belong to. You're left with your thoughts, your judgments, your truth. And if you can withstand that confrontation, if you can remain steady in that existential storm, you emerge with something unshakable, inner sovereignty. This is the freedom of the forsaken. The freedom that comes when you no longer need the world to approve of you. You no longer chase applause because you've discovered a deeper rhythm. You no longer seek constant companionship because you've made peace with your own mind. You no longer fear being misunderstood because you understand yourself. And that kind of freedom is dangerous not to you, but to the systems that thrive on your dependence. The market, the culture, the status games, they rely on your hunger for external approval. But once you stop needing it, you become untouchable. This is why Schopenhauer insisted that the highest form of human life was not social, but contemplative. The philosopher, the monk, the artist alone in their studio, they are not withdrawing from life, they are going deeper into it. They are not escaping reality, they are stripping it of illusion. And in doing so, they cultivate a kind of strength that cannot be faked. The strength to think clearly in chaos. The strength to choose truth over comfort. The strength to walk alone not because you have to, but because you choose to. But let's be clear, this path is not for everyone. It demands a kind of courage that's rare in our age of constant distraction, but it asks you to sit with your pain instead of numbing it, to question your beliefs instead of defending them, to risk being forgotten by the world in order to remember yourself. And that's not a price most people are willing to pay. But for those who do, what they gain is priceless: clarity of mind, depth of soul, and an unbreakable connection to the truth. Think about it. What would your life look like if you no longer feared being alone? What would you create if you weren't trying to prove anything? What decisions would you make if you didn't need anyone's permission? Those aren't hypothetical questions. They're invitations. Invitations to step off the treadmill and to stop chasing shadows, to root yourself in something real. Because the truth is, the world may never understand you. It may call you cold, distant, antisocial. But Schopenhauer would say, let them misunderstand. Let them fill their lives with noise. Let them chase what you've already seen through. Because while they're running, you're becoming something else entirely, a sovereign being, grounded in silence, guided by insight, untouched by the winds of opinion. So yes, isolation may forsake you from the warmth of the crowd, but it grants you access to something far more enduring, the warmth of self-possession and the fire of clarity. The dignity of standing alone not because you must, but because you can. That is the terrifying intelligence Schopenhauer spoke of. And that is the freedom that awaits you on the other side of the silence.